Hello and welcome to another episode of Gemstone Mine. I'm John, and today we have another lesson from CEDH. CEDH is a metagame within the Commander format that sits at one extreme with highly consistent, highly efficient decks. Not all cards are equally powerful in all formats, or even in all metagames. But there are lessons to be learned from how players are brewing with some of the most powerful cards in Magic's history. And some of those most powerful cards are tutors, a fairly divisive concept in the format of Commander. Personally, I think tutors are mostly healthy for the format. I go into questions like these in greater detail in another episode, but I generally feel that non-optimized decks which are tutoring for their pieces they need for the all-set-up stage of the game are just fine. And once you get into that optimized part of the spectrum where you're playing CDH and around CDH, just tutor up your win cons. This episode is going to be all about trying to use tutors to access specific strategies or, at the very least, specific cards out of your deck. But before we get to that, thank you for tuning in and joining us for this episode. And a quick apology if this episode has a lower sound quality than usual. I'm getting some renovations done at home right now, and there is a giant industrial fan going in the room immediately adjacent to the one I record in, so hopefully we can edit that out and keep things relatively good, but if not, apologies. So with that apology out of the way, let me just do the very brief version of the standard content creator boilerplate of like, share, subscribe, comment, yada yada yada. Let's get to the fun stuff now. And I think with where we start, we should discuss what it means when I say card access. For our purposes today, card access means the number of lines you consistently can take to put a particular card or category of cards into a zone, such as into your hand or into play, or wherever you would be able to then access the card and take new and useful game actions with it. You might be looking for a creature who attacks really well, or has a useful ETB ability, or an artifact or enchantment that changes the game in some fundamental way that benefits your deck's strategy in particular. Card draw and card velocity are generally the most common ways to access cards at less optimized ends of the spectrum, and even in optimized decks, this can be seen really clearly on the back of powerful cards like Ad Nauseam. But when you start to approach CDH levels, tutors go hand in hand with the card velocity to allow consistent access to specific cards or categories of cards that you need. There are many different flavors of tutors: tutors into play, tutors into hand, tutors to the top of library, tutor to your graveyard, or even tutor into exile. And if you're going to do a Scryfall search for tutors available in your colors, you're probably going to want to include the phrase, search your library, in the Oracle text. The other side of this coin, though, is not just what tutors you have, but what options you have to tutor for. You may have the best tutors for creatures ever printed in your deck, but if you don't have any creatures you really want to tutor for, then the tutors haven't granted you any better card access. They haven't increased the number of lines you can consistently use to take a specific game action. Now, obviously, in the context of this discussion, I can't presume to know what types of things you may be building around, what type of strategy you're going for, or what type of cards you specifically need to pull off your strategy. You'll need to figure that part out for your own. But what I can do is speak in generalities of how each color and combination of colors are able to both use the resources that are in that color and the tutors that are available in order to get that access they need to get their plans going. Now that we've described what we mean by card access, we're going to use the rest of this episode and next episode to talk about different types of access that different colors and color combinations have when considering tutoring. Each color has some fairly specific strengths in the tutoring department, leaving it unable to access some card types and more easily access other card types. Let's go in Wooburg order, starting with white. White enjoys good access to equipment, fair access to legendary permanents and planeswalkers off the back of cards like Thalia's Lancers, Search for Glory, and Arena Rector, as well as fair access to small creatures, whether low toughness with Recruiter of the Guard or low mana value with Ranger Captain of Eos or Ranger of Eos. White also gets fair access to enchantments with Enlightened Tutor, Idyllic Tutor, Academy Rector, and some access to artifacts, again Enlightened Tutor and Oswald Fiddlebinder. What White gives you access with these tutors, though, is fairly limited. Most of White's strengths are on those small creatures that can be accessed with Recruiter of the Guard, but there aren't a lot of one-drop creatures who are universally good to snag with Ranger Captain of Eos. But artifacts being colorless means you do have good access to lots of equipment if that's the route you're taking. Enchantment tutors can get some pretty nice effects like Rule of Law, Rest in Peace, and some powerful enchantments like Smothering Tithe. I will also say that among one-drop creatures in mono white, probably the best one remains Esper Sentinel at the moment. But if you have a specific strategy like Soul Sisters, or you're in another color combination, it can get pretty interesting with what options you can get. I'd also like to point out Search for Glory is a really interesting special case, particularly more considering what the future might hold for white in terms of tutors. For 2 and a white, you can tutor up a legendary card, and with the large numbers of legendary creatures being released to feed the Commander format, that just means more and more of them are going to be just good enough to include in the 99 of decks. But the card can also incidentally grab snow permanents, such as a snow-covered plains or something like Faceless Haven if you're really hurting for a land, or you could grab something like On Thin Ice if you need some removal, or you can even grab a powerful saga like Ursa Saga. It's pretty versatile for 3 mana, and really sweet design space for white tutors. Moving on, we get blue, where we have good access to instants and sorceries, with cards like Spellseeker, Mystical Tutor, and Solve the Equation. We also get good access to artifacts with Whir of Invention, Transmute Artifact, the whole line of Trophy Mage, Trinket Mage, Treasure Mage, as well as limited access to wizards, thanks to a truly bizarre version of cycling called Wizard Cycling, seen for example on Step Through. Blue also has access to transmute cards, which can fetch specific cards of any type at mana values of 0, 1, 2, 3, 6, and 9, which can be useful to expand your tutor density if there's something in particular you're looking for. As noted in white, most artifacts are colorless, so you can tutor up mana rocks to ramp ahead, or potential combo pieces like Isochron Scepter. Blue also happens to be the color of instants and sorceries, and you'll get a lot of good mileage with your instant and sorcery tutors, but it doesn't really give you consistent access to repeatable effects on permanents. Once you start to add in more colors, this does change, but we'll be talking about that later. Finally of note, blue gets access to Intuition, a fact or fiction style unconditional tutor where an opponent gets to pick which card of 3 you get to keep, and which 2 cards go into your graveyard. There are several different options for Intuition piles, which leave your opponents with no real meaningful choice, but we will discuss these in greater detail when we talk about the relevant color identities. Next up, we have black. Good access to practically anything, particularly when you're on a graveyard strategy. Most of the power in black's tutors is contained on instants and sorceries, notably Demonic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, and Imperial Seal. But don't forget about really powerful creatures like Razaketh the Foul-Blooded, or particularly powerful artifacts like Wishclaw Talisman. Depending on what color identity you're playing in, it may be easier to go grab up that Wishclaw as opposed to trying to go straight for a Demonic Tutor to fetch up your win. Black being able to fetch up just about anything makes it really easy to grab, anything you want to advance your particular strategy, or to pivot and react to a particular situation on the battlefield. But cards like Buried Alive work specifically well with black's many creatures, who work for you when they're in your graveyard, or when setting up for one of black's many reanimation strategies. Wishclaw Talisman is an interesting puzzle to solve in particular, especially among more modern tutor design. Typically in CEDH, a player is going to break up the cost of Wishclaw Talisman by casting it on one turn and then activating it on a later turn when the player is going to go for it, passing the card to an opponent who they really don't ever expect to get to untap with a talisman, as they're going to try to win the game right then and there. Our next color in Wooburg order is red, and coming off of black getting a number of unconditional tutors, red feels distinctly underwhelming. They have some access to particular tribes, such as dragons or goblins, as well as some small creature tutors like Imperial Recruiter. They have some reasonable access to artifacts and equipment, with Goblin Engineer, Godo Bandit Warlord, and they have a few effects that would fall into the category of gambles. Tutors which would let you tutor up any card, but then you run the risk of discarding the card to finish out the card's effect. Now, there are some good goblins, even outside of generically good ones like Dockside Extortionist, and Godo is a legitimately good deck in CEDH. But what red can tutor up is extremely limited. On the goblin side, a card like Goblin Recruiter can be used to set up a Snoop pile, with cards like Conspicuous Snoop and Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker and various other goblins to win the game with only casting creature spells, which is a powerful axis to attack from in CEDH, where countering creatures is a lot more difficult than countering non-creature spells. Magda, Brazen Outlaw also deserves special mention, and while I can't go into all of the lines it takes in the short amount of time that I have available, it does take some setup, but Magda has the option to tutor up all the cards she needs to win the game, or answer almost any permanent type at instant speed with all the tools available only in mono red. Our final color to discuss is green, which has great access to creatures off the backs of cards like Worldly Tutor, Chord of Calling, Finale of Devastation, as well as basic lands and forests. Creatures are definitely the strength of Green's Tutor Suite. It has some of the most powerful tutor targets as well. There are a lot of powerful effects on creatures, just like in white, but a lot more versatility too. You can get your ramp, you can get your artifact and enchantment removal, you can get creature removal, you can get combo pieces, stacks pieces, draw engines, whatever you really want you can probably find printed on a green creature. But do take special note of cards like Birthing Pod and Survival of the Fittest, as not only do they tutor up specific creatures for you, they also put creatures into your graveyard, which can be relevant when you start to access other colors. Also note that green has some of the best directly into play tutors, off of the backs of Chord of Calling and Finale of Devastation and Green Sun Zenith. Finally, note that green actually isn't all that good at finding specific lands. You get cards like Sylvan Scrying, you get Crop Rotation, and that's about it. If you want to find a specific land, you really need to branch out into additional colors in order to make it work. And that brings us to the end of this episode, but not the end of this topic. Next week, I'm going to continue the discussion by trying to look at each color combination in terms of guilds, shards, and wedges, as we see how the different colors complement one another's accessibility suites. So this week, I'm going to ask you guys to tell me, what do you think? What's going to come up in the next episode? What are some of your favorite color combinations specifically to have good access to your cards? Are you somebody who really likes leaning into Selesnya so you always have the creature you want? Or are you more of a Dimir guy or gal who really wants to make sure you can always get anything you need? Let us know in the comments on YouTube, where we are Gemstone Mine Podcast. You can add us on Twitter, where we are at GemstoneMineMTG, or you can send us an email, gemstoneminepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm John, and this is Gemstone Mine.